Hello. Um, Hello. Good evening, guys. Good evening, everyone. I hope you all are doing good in this tough time and probably having a wonderful day. First and foremost, I would like to extend my warm welcome to each and every one of you at this superb LearnVault's webinar session. Hi, I'm Anshul Pandey, co-founder and the CTO of LearnVault, and I'm super excited to have you guys here. And want to thank you for your time, and we really appreciate your commitment towards LearnVault. We know everyone's time is valuable, so without further ado, let's dive right into the topic of the hour: modeling of CO2 injection in tight shale reservoir for enhanced gas recovery. Trust me, guys, it's going to be super exciting session. It's going to be super learning session, because we are fortunate enough to have a superb man and a amazing visionary with us. And when I say, I truly mean it. So let's welcome our guest speaker, Mr. 𝐓𝐢𝐠𝐡𝐭 guys. Mr. Dhruvid, it's so good to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us, guys. Mr. Dhruvid is a data science enthusiast and petroleum engineer with the specialization in reservoir engineering. He is also an expert in numerical modeling and simulation in fluid in porous media. Apart from his academic excellence, his hobbies and interests include traveling, photography, cooking, music, tennis, and cricket. No matter how much I say, it still won't be enough to describe him. He is a true adventurer and an expert. So try to squeeze as much as you can out of him in Q&A section at the end of the webinar. Over to you, Mr. Dhruvid.
Thanks, Anshul. I hope everyone can hear me and see me as well. Can you please confirm?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, okay. Before beginning, I think Anshul has already introduced, but I'll add a little bit more about it on it. So I'm originally from India. I moved to Norway in 2013. I did my bachelor's from India, actually, from Pandit Dindayal Petroleum University. Many of you might have heard about it. And then I moved to Norway after bachelor's. I started doing my master's here. And after master's, I did my PhD on the topic that I'm going to present today. And currently, I'm working as a reservoir engineer at Equinor, formerly known as Statoil. Yeah. I hope through this presentation, I'm able to communicate some learning to you, but the main overall idea would be to bring to your notice the important issues that are going on in the world today and what could be the corresponding research topics to focus on going forward in this direction. So I can just share my screen. Yeah, do you all see my screen? Anshul, can you please confirm?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So yeah, like the poster says that I was going to talk about the CO2 injection in shale gas reservoirs for enhanced gas recovery, but I thought I would also focus a little bit on CO2 when CO2 is injected in deep saline aquifers just for the storage purposes. But before we go on to the topic, I think it's better to understand why overall we need CO2 injection. What is the perspective behind it? So for that, I would say currently in the world, we are 7.7 billion people and increasing day by day. And with this much population, we are emitting roughly 35 gigaton of CO2 every year. So this is like a significant amount of CO2. And what this has led to is it has led to significant amount of temperature increase, which we also known as global warming. And we are on the path of temperature increase of 6 degrees. But then to limit this below the 1990 level, as per the Paris Agreement, we have to limit it to 4-degree temperature increase. In order to achieve this, so the European Union has called for CO2 emission reductions of 80% to bring it down below 1990 levels. And this can be achieved by means of renewables, increased efficiencies, or through CCS, that is commonly known as carbon capture and storage. To achieve this by 2050, we have to reduce nearly 80 gigaton of CO2. That's what European Union has planned about. I would say that's a bit ambitious. But then out of this 80 gigaton of CO2, CCS alone is expected to account for 12.2 gigaton of CO2 emissions. Now, in order to match this figure, 12.2 gigaton of CO2 emissions by 2050, we should be injecting roughly 400 megaton of CO2 per year now, this year currently. But then, just to give an example, we have in Norway a Sleipner CO2 injection project that has been ongoing since 1998. But we are injecting at a rate of only 1 megaton per year. And you can imagine that how many such projects we would need to achieve this 400 megaton per year milestone. So that was a bit of perspective regarding why we need CO2 injection. Now, in oil and gas industry, the CO2 injection is mainly done for two purposes, right? One is the enhanced oil recovery. So if you inject CO2 into a conventional oil reservoir, then the main idea is that by injecting CO2, you are making it dissolve with the oil, and then it reduces its viscosity, and then it provides miscible or partial miscible displacement of the oil to improve the production. So that's one purpose. The other purpose could be carbon storage, that you are just capturing the emissions from the atmosphere and it's storing it back to the subsurface so that you can reduce the emissions. Now, this carbon storage can happen in different kinds of formations. So those formations can be saline formations, oil and gas reservoirs, coal seams, organic rich shales, and basalt formations. We are going to talk about the saline formations and organic rich shales in today's session. Now, for a large scale storage, you basically need saline formations. You cannot just store it in oil and gas reservoirs. The main reason behind that is the saline formations have a huge porous volume. They have much higher porosity. They have considerably good permeability as well. And these are the formations that has brine or salt water present in the formations. You can also store in oil and gas reservoirs. That is was also known as CCUS, that is your carbon capture, utilization, and storage. But in oil and gas reservoirs, you can have intermediate scale project. You cannot store as large volumes as you can store in saline formations. And I'll come back to that, what I mean by why you can store much large volumes in saline formations. The other purpose of CO2 injection, like I mentioned, can be both simultaneously. So you are increasing the oil recovery as well as you are storing at the same time. This is also commonly known as CCUS. But overall, no matter what the purpose is, your storage must be safe, environmental sustainable, and it should be cost effective. If you are able to achieve all these things, then of course that would be a very good project. Now let's look at the CO2 injection into the saline formations. So the figure that you see here, on the left-hand side, you see that the saline water, that is the brine water, it's being produced to the surface, which can be treated and used for a beneficial purposes. It can be either for electricity generation, it can be used for various purposes, for irrigations and any other things. Also, the electricity generation, like in India or in many other countries, in developing countries, it is mainly generated by using coal, which emits a lot of CO2. So then that CO2 can be captured and injected into the saline formations. And from the diagram here, you can see that when CO2 is injected, it kind of forms a CO2 plume. And I'll come back to that again, what exactly that CO2 plume is and why that happens. But these saline formations are generally at a depth greater than 1,000 meters. So that's a significant depth, right? So at that depth, the temperature and pressure of the formation is pretty high. And it's much higher than the critical point of CO2. So if you remember from the studies, the two-phase diagram or the single-phase diagram, when a CO2 has a pressure and temperature higher than the critical point, then it exists in a supercritical stage. So basically, when you have to inject CO2 in such kind of formations, you have to inject it in a supercritical form. And the supercritical point, the critical point for CO2 is at a temperature 31.1 degrees Celsius and at the pressure of 72 atmospheric or roughly 1,000 psi. Another thing is, when you inject CO2 at that depth, so if you look at this plot, on the y-axis we have a depth, on the x-axis is the density. And this line, roughly around 800 meter, is the point where the CO2 reaches its critical point. So after that depth, if you see that the density of CO2 is much higher than 600 kg per meter cube, and at the surface it is pretty low. So what happens is, when you are going deeper into the subsurface, your pressure increases, and that also leads to increase in the density of CO2. Although it increases significantly, but it still remains less than the density of the brine that is in the formation already. Another thing, when your density is increasing, your volume that the CO2 molecule would occupy decreases significantly. So at the surface, if 100 molecule of CO2 occupies the size of this big balloon, as you can see here, then at a depth of 2.5 kilometer or even around 1 kilometer, it reduces by 99.7%. So imagine like the volume that you would see at the surface for CO2 gas, how much it would occupy at the subsurface. It's significantly low. So in that perspective, you can actually store a lot more CO2 than you would imagine in a way. So like I say here, it would require a storage volume. The required storage volume is substantially less. Okay. Okay, moving on. Now the question comes, how is CO2 trapped into the subsurface? So when you are injecting a deep saline aquifers, the main trapping mechanism that acts are the structural trapping. It's similar to what you see in an oil and gas reservoir as well. So it's just trapped into a formation which is overlined by a seal or a cap rock, which is basically an impermeable formation. So when you're injecting CO2, it just stays there and it doesn't migrate upwards. The other kind of trapping is a residual trapping, where because of the flow of CO2, some of the molecules is left behind into the pore space, and that's also called as a residual trapping. Something else that can happen is a solubility trapping, that your injected CO2 dissolves in brine and creates a different kind of phase, and that dissolution also increases in a way increases in your way your storage capacity. So that is called as solubility trapping. And additional trapping mechanism that can be is a mineral trapping, where this dissolution of CO2 with brine can lead to a reaction, and that reaction can cause dissolution or precipitation of the minerals in the formation itself. So generally, it's not just one kind of trapping mechanism that is working. It's generally a combination of all these four mechanisms that act together, and that's what leads to the trapping of CO2 into the formation. Okay, so the figure here on the right, this big picture is just shows the depths of different kind of formations. You can see here coal, then it's below it says oil and natural gas formation, and below it comes the saline formations. Now, when CO2 is injected in this saline formation, in a simplistic term, it would look like a figure that we show here, that we see here on the left. You can see that the CO2 is injected in the center of the figure. There is an aquifer that is denoted by this dark gray zone, and then there is a cap rock above it, which has these dotted lines. The depth of this aquifer is greater than 800 meters, and as denoted by this equation here on the left, it says that viscosity of CO2 at depth increases, but it's still one order of magnitude lesser than the viscosity of water. So if your viscosity is very less, then CO2 has a very high mobility. So it will move into the formation at a much faster rate, and it would, of course, displace the brine that is already existing there. Another important thing to note is, like I said before as well, the density of CO2 will be significantly lower than the density of water or the brine that's existing there. So what happens is, when you inject CO2, because of the buoyancy, the CO2 will start migrating towards the top of the formations. And that migration leads to this dome kind of a structure, which is also known as CO2 plume. But what about the formation pressure itself? So since you are injecting something into an equilibrium state where there is already a brine, then you tend to increase the pressure. So the CO2 injection will lead to an increase in the fluid pressure or the pore pressure, and that pressure changes will result in differences in the mean effective stress. What is the mean effective stress? Is basically the total stress minus the pore pressure. So when your pore pressure because of fluid injection is increasing, your mean effective stress would reduce. And similarly, there will be temperature differences because of the different temperature of the CO2 that you are injecting and the temperature in the formation. There will be temperature differences that will also lead to changes in the mean effective stress. Now, why we need to know about the mean effective stress? Because when there is a change in mean effective stress, it can lead to deformation. Because when you're injecting something which is already in equilibrium state, it can expand your pore volumes. It can also lead to a banding of a cap rock. And eventually, if you keep on injecting more and more, it can lead to a deformation. That is in terms of faults or creating new fractures. When a fracture starts happening in the cap rock, then CO2 can start migrating upwards. And if that happens, and somehow because of more and more fractures, if it leads to the surface, once the leakage of CO2 starts, then there would be no control. So the overall purpose of reducing the emission by CO2 injection won't happen. So then what is the primary risk and challenge in CO2 storage? Now the primary risk, like I said, is the leakage of CO2 and also the leakage of the displaced brine, because the brine that you are displacing can reach a boundary and that can also be leaked to the surface or to the nearby aquifer. This leakage can happen because of the fluid pressure buildup, like I mentioned, and it can trigger microseismic events, open fractures, and reactivate faults. So then to understand whether this leakage would happen or not, then you would need to pay special attention to hydromechanical coupled processes. Now, what are those hydromechanical coupled processes? Then this hydromechanical coupled process is mainly refers to the physical interaction between the hydraulic and the mechanical processes. But then the question might come, what is actually hydraulic and mechanical processes? Then in simple terms, we can say that when there is change in stress on something, it can produce a change in the fluid pressure. And if there is a change in the fluid pressure and changes the volume of the porous media, that is the changes in the stress and the fluid pressure, it's leading to the expansion of the pore volume or reduction of the pore volume, or in other terms, it can be called compaction, then those can be accounted for hydraulic properties. But when this change in fluid pressure produces deformation, such as if it starts deforming the cap rock, that is, it can lead to a bending of a cap rock or it can lead to a fracture, because then that might induce permeability changes. If there is a fracture, the permeability of the cap rock would increase. And when you start accounting for those kind of a deformation, then you have to, then those are called as mechanical properties. So the combination of both, where a fluid pressure changes leads to pore volume expansion, and then pore volume expansion leading to the permeability changes, then combination of all these things is called as hydromechanical coupling. And this is something that really helps us to understand whether your CO2 storage is safe or not at a particular injection rate into a particular formation. Not going too much into detail about this hydromechanical processes and how it is modeled, but I can show like some of the examples where this study has been done, this kind of a study has been done and what they have found. So currently there are 18 large-scale ongoing CCS projects worldwide, right? But we will look into two examples. One is from the Sleipner field, that is Norway. That is one of the longest and the oldest CCS project going on. So CO2 injection at Sleipner field. This is in Norway. Yeah. The injection that is being happening, it's injected into an 𝐒𝐢𝐠 formation. So there is a formation at a certain depth, and the name is called for the formation is called 𝐒𝐢𝐠, and 1 megaton of CO2 is injected every year, and this has been happening since 1998. This formation is complicated by the presence of thin shale layers. So that's a sandstone formation, and then there are many thin layers of shales, but they do not laterally extend throughout the length of the formation. So then you can see some different patches of those shale layers in this figure. The permeability is pretty good. It's 2 Darcy, and the porosity is as high as 35%. So this is what the best kind of formation that you can get. So with this kind of a porosity and permeability, you can expect that the CO2 would flow pretty easily into the formation. But the another important thing to note here is the total pore volume for this formation is 6 into 10 power 11 meter cube. So that's significantly high. And if you consider how much CO2 they have injected until 2010, then it is just 0.003% of the total pore volume. So you can imagine, like, if this comes close to 50% or something CO2 injection, how much CO2 that would account for at the surface. This is in the subsurface at a very high density, but at the surface it would be like a huge. It has a huge potential. So when the injection so far has been so little into such a large pore volume, then the pressure changes are expected to be negligible, right? Because it's just a very little fraction of the total pore volume. The figure here shows the wellhead pressure plot versus time. And what they have found is that there is a very slight increase during the injection period. And the increase has been only from 6.2 megapascal to 6.4 megapascal. So after years of injection, the pressure increase has been only 0.2 megapascal. But since the injection rate has also been very low. Also in this figure, you see that there are two spikes. So there is one spike here in the beginning, and then there is one spike around 2001, which could be because of the pressure increase. But then later on, the studies found that this was mainly because of the technical issues that they had. So in the beginning, it was more about the pressure increase was caused because of the blockage by sand. And around 2001, it was mainly caused because of the temperature control issues, some measurement issues. Overall, the pressure has been very stable, and like I said, it has just led to an increase of 0.2 megapascal. So then, with such small pressure change, it is very unlikely that significant deformation will have occurred. Like I mentioned before, that fluid pressure changes might lead to a deformation, but then when your pressure change at a field level is so low, then you can think that there wouldn't be any deformation that would have occurred in the formation. But then what if the injection rate was 1000 megaton per year? So then there was a model by Wangen et al. In 2016, and they consider 4 different injection scenarios: 1, 10, 100, and 1000 megaton per year. They only considered single phase fluid flow, and the injection time used was nearly 25 years. What they found was that the figure here left, I would not go into detail. It just says how much there was a pressure increase. And after 25 years of injection, they found the pressure increase was 0.6 bar at 1 megaton. And on the right here shows the surface uplift. Because of fluid injection, there would lead to a deformation. There will be a bending of cap rock. So that bending could cause an uplift in the surface. But at 1 megaton per year, they found the uplift would be around 0.02 meters. So that's like nearly just 2 centimeters after 25 years of injection at 1 megaton. So that's significantly low and nothing to worry about. But when this rate was varied and increased up to 1000 megaton per year, so as you can see plot here, we have one plot for 1 megaton per year, the left topmost plot. The right topmost plot is for the 10 megaton, and bottom is for 100 and 1000 megaton. And if you look at the pay special attention to the y-axis, when you're multiplying the injection rate by 10, your uplift is being multiplied by 10. So at 1000 megaton per year of injection, your uplift after 25 years would be roughly around 30 meters. That's what the model showed. And as per the model, it showed that the seabed uplift scales with injection rate. Imagine 30 meters of a surface uplift. And if it's a seabed between the seafloor, how much sea level rise it could cause and how much disturbance it can cause. Of course, this is just a homogeneous based on a homogeneous model. In the real field scale, I don't think these values would be realistic. But even if it's like 5 meters in real scale, in real field, then it's significant. Next example is CO2 injection in Sala field. Okay, so here it was a different story. So in Algeria, they had this Sala field where all the neighboring formations of the fields were producing high amount of CO2. Now, to remove that CO2, what they decided was to strip the CO2 from the gas production and then inject it into the 𝐓𝐢𝐿 gas reservoir. So there was already a producing gas reservoir, as you can see here in this curve, this blue part, where the pink lines are the producing wells. But then below the producing zone, there was an aquifer. So they decided that they could inject the CO2 into the aquifer. Now, this decision was made because they also found that there was no real communication between the producing zone and the injection zone. So then if there is no real communication, then it shouldn't affect the production wells. So that's why they decided to inject into the producing zone, and then they planned 3 wells, KB 503, 502, and 501. The injection zone here in this case was pretty thin reservoir. It was just 20 meters, sandstone fractured, permeability of nearly 1 millidarcy, and porosity of 13 to 20%. And the figure here shows the average pressure plot for all these formations. The red one is the average pressure for the producing well, and the other 3 lines that you see here are for the injection wells. And you can see that the starting point was 18 megapascal, but after around 2011, it reached to nearly 26 megapascal. So in this case, there was a significant increase in pressure. Okay, just to summarize about the CO2 injection in deep saline aquifers, what are the key learnings? I would say measuring fluid pressure in the cap rock plays an important role in identifying the deformation. So when you measure the fluid pressures, you can know how it is behaving into the formation, and you can predict what kind of changes it can induce into the formations. Then there are very high chances of deformation initially, because what happens is, like, when you have already a saturated brine in the formation and you are displacing that with a very less viscous CO2, then the capillary forces between those two phases induces permeability reduction, and that permeability reduction leads to an overpressure. So initially, it's much important to track the pressure, but with time, from the field examples, they have found that with time, the CO2 injection becomes safer. Increase in pore volume or the fluid pressure leads to expansion of pore volume and rock deformation, and also it can lead to increase in permeability by creating fractures, and the presence of pre-existing faults in the cap rock can be activated by CO2 injection, because all the models that they study is with respect to a homogeneous cap rock. But what if there is already a fracture in the formation in the cap rock? Will that be activated, or will that lead to migration of CO2 out of that cap rock? So this can pose as a risk of leakage. So on a field scale, from the studies that have been done so far, CO2 injection overall, I would say, seems very safe. But then hydromechanical processes, like I pointed out, should be included in the modeling. Overall, to reverse the climate change, we would need thousands of fields like Snipener to accommodate the world's CO2 emissions. Now, going back to the shale gas reservoirs, this is another perspective. Now, this is important because in shale gas reservoirs, you can inject CO2 to enhance the gas recovery, as well as you can store the CO2. But the mechanisms that are involved in shale gas reservoirs are different than the mechanisms that are generally present in conventional oil and gas reservoirs. But let's look at why this shale gas is pretty important. Because what has happened is, over the past decade, the US and the technological advancement, the US shale gas production, or the tight oil production, has increased up to 20 trillion cubic feet. And that was one of the main reasons why there was an economic or crude oil crisis in 2014-15, because they started producing humongous amount of shale gas and the oil, which couldn't cope with the demand that we had at that moment. And going forward, the speed at which they are developing these fields, it is expected that it can go as high as 40 trillion cubic feet by 2040. But I doubt that figure because of this corona pandemic. I think this needs to be readjusted, but it will still be a significant amount of production. And this is also one of the reasons why we have low crude oil prices and the low gas prices at the moment, because there is so much of supply than the demand we have in the market. But then what are shale gas reservoirs and how are they different from the conventional reservoirs? So first and foremost, the most important characteristic in the shale gas is that these shale formations have extremely low matrix permeability. So if you look at the figure here on the left, it shows that the permeability in the shale gas or a tight gas is in the range of nanodarcies to microdarcies. Whereas in a conventional gas reservoir, we would have the permeability in the range of millidarcy to darcy. So then in order to produce from this kind of a formations, you need large scale hydraulic fracturing to stimulate the reservoir to connect better reservoirs with the well. Another important characteristics in this is that the gas is stored in two different ways. One is the free gas, like in existing in the pore space, like we have in conventional reservoirs. But the other important characteristic is that the shale formations have an organic matter or the chirogenic material or the clay minerals that can absorb this molecules of methane. So then the gas, significant amount of gas also exists in the adsorbed form. And this adsorbed amount can account for 5 to 80% of initial in place volumes. Now, this adsorption, when you try to model, it brings non-linearity into the equations. So then it becomes difficult to model. And also because of this nanopore structure of the matrix, it induces a lot of complex flow mechanisms. So it becomes very difficult to predict how your production from the shale gas would behave. But in spite of this technological advancement and the fracturing done, only 5 to 20% of this gas is recovered economically through natural pressure depletion. Right, so there is still more than 80% of gas that is left behind in the formation in spite of fracturing. So then what does this indicate? Indicates that there is a significant potential for enhanced shale gas recovery. And a solution for this is to inject CO2. How CO2 increases the oil recovery? It is because the lab experiments have shown that CO2 has the organic matter that exists in the shale can preferentially absorb CO2 over methane. So it can actually, when CO2 comes in contact with the organic matter, CO2 itself can get absorbed and replace the methane that is already there in the system. If this mechanism works in the real field application, then it can has a potential to increase recovery by 20 to 50%. So then you can actually increase the production by 5 times, or you can produce 5 times of your producible reserves. So then the question comes, theoretically, this looks so good. So if you apply this, can it lead to a carbon neutral energy? How? Because if you inject CO2, you're going to produce a lot more shale gas from the experimental results. And those amount of shale gas can easily replace coal worldwide that is being used for electricity generation. So you are now generating electricity with a more cleaner fossil fuel. It will lead to less CO2 emissions, and also still the CO2 emissions that is being emitted can be captured and stored into the formation to produce more gas. So overall, it can develop a cycle, and can this lead to a carbon neutral energy? That needs to be analyzed. But of course, this is based on the theoretical studies. In real field cases, it actually works differently, as we all know. Moving forward, so then when we talk about the adsorption, right, how do you model that when you inject CO2 and it replaces methane and you instead end up producing more amount of uh, methane? That is conventionally being modeled using the Langmuir isotherm. What it says that with increasing pressure, as shown in this plot, with increasing pressure, your adsorbed content for that particular component will increase. and it is indicated by this PL pressure and VL. VL is basically the amount of gas adsorbed at the pressure PL, and PL is your Langmuir pressure. This is basically the pressure at which half of your gas content will be adsorbed. For a two-component system, you will have an additional component that is a CO2 and methane. Then it is represented by this formula. I won't go into detail, but it is of course dependent on the mole fraction. But now you should imagine in a way, this means that your amount of adsorption would depend on the number of moles present. But the CO2 has a different molecular size and the methane has a different molecular size. So isn't it true that the amount of adsorption should depend actually on the available surface area, because both these different molecules will acquire different amount of surface area. So then there was a model that we had presented. I don't think we have time to go through this model in detail, but the whole principle here is that your your single molecule of CO2 or methane, both of them will occupy different amount of surface area. So it shouldn't really matter on the number of moles present, but it should matter on how much surface area they would occupy. Doing this kind of a modeling, we kind of produce an alternative, and this is how the adsorption isotherm looks like for different kind of shale fields in the US. So there are three dominant shale fields: Marcellus Shale, Barnett Shale, and Eagle Ford. The gray line in each of this plot indicate the adsorption capacity for methane, and the yellow line on each of this plot shows the adsorption capacity both for the model and for the experiment for CO2. For each of this field, you can see that the adsorption capacity with increasing pressure for CO2 is significantly higher. So that means when CO2 can come into the contact with the organic matter, the organic matter can absorb a lot more CO2 than what methane could be absorbed at the same pressure. So yeah, so this also again confirms the potential for CO2 injection into the shale formations. Now to model this, there are different kind of mechanisms involved. So here we consider just a matrix of a shale in a box-like structure, and we can assume that there are different mechanisms acting. One mechanism is the adsorption, the second is the diffusion, third is the advection, and fourth is the gas slippage. I can explain each of this method. The adsorption is what I just talked about. It determines how much amount of CO2 or methane can be absorbed. Diffusion basically indicates how fast your CO2 will migrate into the system based on the concentration gradient. So if you can imagine a glass of water and you put a drop of ink, although it doesn't really causes much change in the pressure, but the ink would start spreading into the glass of water, and that is mainly because of the difference in concentration of the ink molecules. The third mechanism that we have considered is the advection, which is also very prominent. This is mainly the flow due to viscous forces or because of the pressure gradient into the matrix. And last is the gas slippage. The gas slippage happens in shale gas reservoirs because your size, the mean free path of the gas molecule, is actually larger or of comparable amount to the pore size, because since shale has a very nanopore structure. So when that happens, your collision between the molecules and the wall of the pore throat becomes much more significant. And it will, you can imagine as a gas molecule popping out through the small pore throats, and that popping out effect causes the gas slippage effect. In terms of transport equation, when you account for all this mechanism, it is denoted by this equation. So just a normal material balance equation where the term on the left-hand side is a partial derivative with respect to time. That basically indicates how much gas is stored. Pi indicates the free gas and Ai hat indicates the adsorbed gas. So this indicates how much gas is stored at a particular time. We also call as accumulation term. The first term on the right hand side is the advective term, basically the flow in the x direction due to pressure differences, and the rightmost term is the flow in the x direction because of the concentration differences, and that denotes the diffusion. Now, to indicate whether how much recovery is being improved by CO2 injection, we derive another factor called F. Basically, F is a ratio of the recovery in case you have injected CO2 and in case you don't inject CO2. So what is the ratio between those two cases? Then that is denoted by F. So basically when you have F equals to 1, that means the CO2 injection didn't have any effect at all. But from the results, we found that when you inject CO2 in shale gas, it can go up to as high as 2. I won't comment more on this A parameters and the influence of the well pressure because that could take a long time. But overall, I could say that the model was able to predict that you can actually double your recovery just by injecting CO2 into the formation that we have assumed here. Now, the role of diffusion. So this is the case. What we have done here is like we are looking at a core scale. So we are just taking a core that is 7 centimeters long and it's 3 centimeters in thickness. And what we have done here is like we inject CO2 for 0.05 days and then let it produce. So by doing this, we should be able to see the effect of diffusion. And this was done at a various diffusion coefficient. We could see that when your diffusion coefficient is higher, 1e minus 6, denoted by the blue line, the plot here shows the gas recovery. We could see that when your diffusion coefficient is higher, then you get higher recovery. That's the distribution plot. Let's forget about the plot on the left, but focus on the 2 plots here, the middle one and the right one. The middle one, the solid lines indicates the fraction of methane present in the free form, and the dotted line indicates the fraction of methane present in the adsorbed form along the core after the CO2 production has already taken place, or after this methane production has already taken place, that is after 0.15 days. As you can see, the fraction of free gas, that is the solid line, is higher than the fraction of the dotted line, which denotes the adsorbed form. So we can see that after your CH4 is being led to produce, your methane exists along the core in the free form compared to the adsorbed form. But the figure here on the right indicates different thing. So here it says the dotted lines are much higher compared to the solid lines. So that means the fraction of CO2 exists in the core in the adsorbed form. So this also indicates that CO2 is able to replace methane from the core, and that is what has led to increase in recovery. At a field scale, when we simulate this example, and this is through huff and puff process. So what we are trying to do is we are letting methane to produce for first 300 days through pressure depletion, natural pressure depletion. Then we are injecting CO2 for 300 days. So that leads to an increase in total pressure. And then again, we are letting it produce methane and then again injecting. So this is called a cyclic injection or a huff and puff process, which each cycle we can see that my CO2, the methane production, the recovery is increasing. You can see that this is here until it's the natural product depletion. Then after 600 days, because of CO2 injection, it jumps. So your CO2 is able to replace methane, and your methane recovery, the gas recovery, is increasing significantly. If it would be just pressure depletion, it would be around 40%, but with CO2 injection, it has gone up to around 80%. That's the effect of the diffusion. There's not much time to explain what is the effect of diffusion, but I can say that what we have found, diffusion has generally a positive effect on the recovery because it makes CO2 to migrate more deeper into the system. It makes the flow more easier. But then whatever research that is being done in this field for CO2 injection in shale gas production for enhanced recovery, there are some limitations in all the research that is being done currently. From experimental point of view, majority of the experiments are conducted on crust samples. Since the shale gas has very small pores, it would take a long time to perform experiments on a direct real core that you get from the reservoir. So what they do is they crush the samples and they pack it into a cubic form in the core shape again, and then they perform the experiment. But by doing so, you are losing the properties of the actual reservoir. So then the conclusion made on the experiments, do they hold correct? That's a bit of questionable. Also, the experiments are being performed on a dried sample. So when you do it on a dried sample, then you end up overestimating the adsorption capacity, because in the real formation there is always water phase present, or there is always moisture present. Since these gas reservoirs are water-wet system, then how would you analyze the impact of the moisture of water? Because that could also lead to reduction in your adsorption capacity. So that is something to be focused on. Also, when you are injecting CO2 in a supercritical phase, so it's basically a liquid phase, and that liquid phase can lead to a swelling of the clay content, and that again would affect the adsorption capacity. Also, when CO2 is injected, and if it has a formation which can induce chemical reaction, then that chemical reaction would lead to a dissolution and precipitation of some of the minerals in the formation, and then that could lead to a mechanical weakening of the formation. By mechanical weakening, it would reduce the integrity of the formation, so it can collapse by the CO2 injection much faster. And also, like I said before, it can lead to the leakage. So what are the effect on this what are the effect of mechanical weakening of CO2 injection or organic rich shale? Those needs to be analyzed. There are several other effects as well, but the most important thing is when the research is being done, each parameter is looked separately. But what is the combined effect? That needs to be analyzed, because there are no such data that exist at the moment which can actually say that CO2 injection in shale reservoirs can improve the recovery by 5 times. If that actually happens in the field case, then that's really, really good. Yes, that's all what I had for today. But I would like to end with this key research issues for you to keep in mind, that you can also use during your studies, or if you are taking up a research project, you can try to focus on this, so that that can really benefit the understanding of these mechanisms for CO2 injection in shales. These are some of the slides were mostly from the papers that I have published. If you are interested in reading those papers, you can just visit my LinkedIn profile, and I think most of the papers are listed there. So you'll be able to find a link, or you can also send me a email or message, or connect to me. I can share the papers to you if you're not able to download it. Okay, thank you so much. Let me know if you have any questions.
Okay, so thank you very, very much, Mr. Dhruvit, for this amazing and informative session. We cannot be more grateful to you for taking out substantial amount of time from your life to fill us up with the knowledge. This indeed was a very productive session, and I am sure students will cherish your insights talk on the same. We definitely look forward to continuing this professional courtesy and this relationship with you in near future. And we sincerely wish for for you and your family safety and health. Guys, if you have any relevant, appropriate doubts or queries, please ask in the live chat. Sir, we have two questions in the live chat.
Okay. I don't see the chat. Okay, yeah, in the comment section. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Can increased pressure convert CO2 into CO2 to supercritical state? Yes, of course, that's what happens. But then you arrive at a lot of complications as well, because you suddenly you are injecting considering the density of the CO2 at the surface, right, which is significantly low. But then if it starts increasing and you are maintaining the wellhead pressure and all those kind of things, considering the density at the surface, but then if you start injecting and then it changes into a supercritical state, that means your density is increasing significantly. If your density starts increasing significantly, that you might lose the injectivity of the CO2, and you won't probably, the surface facilities that you have developed would probably not work. So that's not a good idea. If always it's better to start injecting in a supercritical state from the surface itself. Okay, let me know if I miss any questions. Then there was another question from Miss Gamer King. Okay, that's a good name. Who decides the technique of injection at a drill site? Is it the driller's duty or a reservoir engineer or mod lover duty? Okay, so yeah, at the drill site, it's mainly everything, it's pre-decided, right? So when you have a field that you are planning to develop, then you need to make a proposal to the government with the strategies that you are going to perform. So those strategies are actually made in collaboration with the drilling engineer as well as reservoir engineer as well as geologist, depending on the data you have. Once that proposal is accepted, then first thing is like then based on that proposal, what you have predicted, what the strategies that you have prepared, it is done accordingly to that. So it's not actually on the day of the operation a driller comes and decides like how I'm going to drill. He has already got a plan that where exactly he's supposed to drill, at what pressure he's have to maintain. Those things are already pre-decided. Of course, when you start doing it in real field, then there has to be some improvisation that needs to be done, and that again is actually made in collaboration with the people sitting in the office at the also in the taking into account the reservoir engineers as well. Thank you, thank you. What about this seismic activity? Seismic activity due to CO2 injection, or I'm not sure what you are trying to ask, or the seismic activity in terms of the exploration that you are asking about. Can you elaborate, Sabah Nashid Khan? Yeah, I don't see any. Does it have any impact on it? So seismic activity. So there are two kinds of seismic activity. First is like when you are in the exploration phase, right? When you are trying to find whether there is an oil and gas reservoir, or whether you are trying to find whether an aquifer is suitable for CO2 injection. So that kind of a seismic activity is done much before when you are just in the exploration phase. But when you have actually started CO2 injection and then you are studying the pressures, then of course seismic is again used to study how the CO2 is migrating into the formation, because the seismic data would also tell you based on the pressure different, based on the time travel that it takes in presence of a solid formation or in presence of a formation which has a fluid. There will be difference in the timing, in the response time. So that can indicate whether your pressure development has increased, or it can also indicate where your CO2 has migrated. Of course, then there is another thing that is called microseismicity. That is basically it creates vibrations, and that vibrations can happen at the surface because of CO2 injection if you are increasing the pressure too much into the subsurface, and it starts creating fractures. So to avoid that, that's why it's important, like I said, important to monitor the fluid pressure when you're injecting, and also to model the hydromechanical process. Who plans that? Reservoir engineering? It's not one person, it's always a combination of everyone. Because like I'm a reservoir engineer, there are some strategies I might propose, but then it might not be relevant in terms of operations. So there has to be an overall involvement of all kind of peoples when the strategies are being made. for such critical projects. Yeah, I don't see any more questions.
Yes, sir. So, can we end?
Yes, sure. If there is any more questions, if you get any questions, just you can send it to me via email or on LinkedIn. You can connect with me on LinkedIn, and I can try to answer those things as and when there is a time available. Sure.
Okay. So please make sure to fill up the Google form link to earn the certificate. And also, I would like to thank my friend and CEO, Kushal Jategaonkar, and our whole LearnVault team for organizing a successful webinar. Thank you, Sanskar Trivedi, for handling the technical aspects, Abhijit Mishra and Isheeta Srivastava for support block. And once again, thank you, sir.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye bye, sir.